Welcome to the hashtag CNF podcast, episode number 14. Yowza. We're on a roll, people. You could say we're rolling. Or not. Anyway, thanks for listening. I've got to say, I'm thankful I get to talk to the kind of people who come on this podcast and listen to them share their insights into what it means to write true stories and tell true stories. I love hearing about their processes and work habits, and it's always a thrill for me, and I hope it is for you. Episode 14 does not disappoint. My guest is Glenn Stout, series editor for the Best American Sports Writing Anthology, longform editor at SB Nation, and author of several books, including Young Woman in the Sea and Fenway 1912, The Birth of a Ballpark, A Championship Season, and Fenway's Remarkable First Year. He talks about reading poetry in a baseball uniform while standing outside Fenway Park, while also taking swigs from a 2-liter bottle of Bloody Marys. Yeah, it's good. He also talks about his first writing assignment and the one thing a writer can control. Hear about all that and more on the next episode of hashtag CNF. I understand you're on the radio this morning talking about David Price.
Oh, yeah, talking about David Price. I'm WBUR, which is one of the NPR stations, the NPR news station in Boston. I've been their Red Sox analyst for, 10 or 12 years. So probably 6 or 8 times a year when something notable happens with the Red Sox, they call me up early in the morning and ask me about it, and I string a few words together and try to sound like I know what I'm talking about.
Now, are the Red Sox your team?
No.
You're from Ohio, so probably Cleveland based, right?
No, I just tell people that I'm a baseball fan.
Gotcha.
Pittsburgh was my big team growing up.
Gotcha.
Because in Columbus, Ohio, the minor league team was the Columbus Jets, which were the Pittsburgh AAA farm team.
Okay.
So that was my orientation, but as an adult, I just kind of say I'm a baseball fan, and I think nobody really has been able to figure out my allegiance, which I think is a product of some of the work that I've done. But I'm not a Red Sox fan. Everybody assumes that because I've written so much about them, but it's just because I was in Boston, I found them interesting.
Right. That's kind of the stance I've adopted with ball. I mean, I would say if I had an allegiance, it's to the Red Sox since I grew up an hour south of Boston. But being a competitive player for so many years and then just being a sports writer, I'm just more a fan of just the game.
I mean, I started playing again when I was 34 and played for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And that made me realize that I liked playing a lot more than observing. It also made me realize that I actually knew nothing about baseball, because when you're young, you don't even think about it. When you're older, you realize how much you have to think about it.
Yeah.
And then also when you're in the business, the starry-eyed stuff goes away pretty quick, and you have to be clear-eyed and objective no matter what you're writing about. I mean, I had one writer acquaintance say that he couldn't imagine ever writing about a team that he wasn't a fan of.
Mm-hmm.
And my response was almost the opposite. I can't imagine writing as a fan.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just not for the kind of work that I do, which is historical. You're trying to, you're trying to find out what happened. And, that's often not the thumbnail story that has been passed down by history. And you have to, baseball metaphor, call them like you see them.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And that's what particularly when you're doing historical research, you can't, you can't go in there and say, oh, I want to find this.
Right.
This is the conclusion I want to find. Let me find evidence that supports that and not look anywhere else. You can't do that.
No. I mean,
and that characterizes 95% of baseball history, sports history, quite frankly.
Yeah. If you go in with such a narrow mindset, I mean, you just paint yourself into this corner that's, frankly, not even fun to be in. It's the fun is in the discovery.
You don't learn anything.
Right.
You're just confirming what you already know. So.
Yeah, and what fun is that?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I really want to thank you for carving out some time in your morning here to come on the podcast. I really appreciate it. So I wanted to to start off asking you about was sort of the opening line to your essay in the Best American Sports Writing this year, that you grew up a sick kid. And I was wondering, like, how did that inform the person and the writer you became, and what impact that had on your adolescence, and then ultimately what you went into as an adult?
Well, I mean, I think more about it now than I ever did then.
Mm-hmm.
So then it was just the way things were. And I don't want to overstate it. I wasn't like, a cancer victim or something like that, where I was on life and death all the time. I was just sick all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And would get sick often, would have to, had breathing trouble, and would have to be in bed, and missed a lot of school and things like that. I think it just, leads you to having somewhat of a more internal life.
Mm-hmm.
And that leads itself to books and reading. I spent a lot of time in the hospital when I was really little, and in a weird way, I kind of think, some of the normal bonding that often takes place maybe didn't quite take place as strongly with me. I found my bonds elsewhere,
Mm-hmm.
emotionally, and that would be, in the imagination or to other things. I mean, I was, this baseball obsessed kid from the time I could walk. Nobody could ever really explain it. I spent, so much time, buried under quilts, reading stacks of books, with mindless television on in the background. I think, as I got older, slowly I also got healthier. I really wasn't sick too much once I reached junior high and high school, not nearly as much as I was before, because I was also very vigorous. I was a big kid,
Mm-hmm.
always doing sports. It's not like, I had extended periods where I couldn't do anything, but these would be weeks and week long, 2 weeks. Once I had mono, and it was like 6 weeks. Once again, it made, adolescence a little awkward because you don't feel totally comfortable with who you are,
Mm-hmm.
because in the back of your head, you think there's something wrong with you. In the back of your head, you think you're probably not going to live a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, all these crazy kid thoughts that would go through your head. So,
Yeah.
so all that informs it in a way, and just led me to spend a lot of time in books and a lot of time reading, and a lot of time imagining. And when you live in the interior world, I think you kind of become a little obsessed about how you express yourself. And at a certain point, that kind of, when I was about 14, that kicked in with me. And I realized that's, kind of what I wanted to, the vein I kind of wanted to work.
Did you
the rest of my life.
Right, and when you were 14 and that kicked in, was there a mentor or a teacher that?
No, not really. I mean, I've described the moment before, and there was an assignment in 8th grade to basically cut pictures out of magazines and illustrate them with poems. And for whatever reason, my brother had an anthology at home. My brother was 4 years older, and it was Langston Hughes. And I read this poem called Suicide's Note that goes, "The calm, cool face of the river asked me for a kiss."
Hmm.
And, it's that image gazing into the water. For whatever reason, I saw that. It knocked me on my ass. I couldn't believe that something could do that. It almost makes me tear up every time I think about it, because that Satori moment that, pitched me sort of headlong into words in one way or another. And
it kind of woke you up in a lot of ways.
I just would, I was probably the only 14-year-old kid in rural Ohio who was reading the simple stories by Langston Hughes when they were 14 years old. But, I read Hughes, and then I read, writers related to Hughes and writers related to those writers, and sort of on my own from the age of 14 to 18, worked my way through 20th century American literature, particularly poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of without instruction, except for this used bookstore in Columbus, Ohio, called My Back Pages, where these the two hippies who ran it were really indulgent with me, and would let me roam the bookstore for hours. And it wasn't a very big store.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually just contacted one of the guys recently and thanked him for that, because it was such a transformative thing to be able to go somewhere where you could be surrounded by words, and this like word life had some currency.
Huh. What were those exchanges like with them? Did they just kind of, figuratively take you by their hand and just kind of say, "Hey, you might like this"?
Like, they'd see what I was buying and like, "Oh, have you read this? Have you read this? You might like this." Just very, very, not very aggressive, but they took me seriously too. Mm-hmm. It wasn't, "Hey, kid, stop on over the books."
Yeah.
And that was just very, very helpful at that time.
Was that one of the earliest times that someone was taking you seriously and your reading seriously? And what kind of?
I think so. I mean, I also had a wonderful teacher in high school who was she was barely older than we were,
mm-hmm.
and she was the journalism teacher. When I was involved with the school paper, we actually called it a news magazine then, and she really liked me. She basically let me do whatever I wanted and write as much as I wanted, and there were times where I wrote almost every word in the newspaper, so it seemed at that time, and that was just very important because she paid attention to me and she let me know that she thought I was talented at what I was doing, and that made a difference,
mm-hmm.
And then gave me opportunity to do it. I mean, and to this day, the only journalism class I ever took was in high school.
Mm-hmm.
So that was all hugely important. Because even then I kind of realized what I was getting in class was relatively meaningless.
Yeah.
The teachers didn't know very much. I realized I was better read than they were in 20th century American literature by the time I was about 16.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'd ask them about people and they'd look at me like I was from Mars. They might be able to talk about Mark Twain, but it's pretty much stopped there.
Right.
In the meantime, I'm reading, Charles Olson and Jack Kerouac and, William Burroughs and, just a lot of crazy whacked out stuff and a lot of much more contemporary stuff.
Yeah, that must have been a bruise to their egos.
I have no idea. I think in most instances they didn't know what I was talking about.
Yeah, just brushed you off as some.
They just didn't even. They had no reference for. They didn't know who these writers were.
Yeah.
They were just English teachers. They weren't like, interested in writing, particularly or words. It's just a job.
Huh.
They were fine people. I'm not, criticizing them.
Yeah.
My wife's a teacher, and it's like, hey, you can't do 1,000 things.
Right. Right. Now, why do you think you were drawn to sports as a backdrop for a lot of your writing?
Well, I think, that sort of happened by accident. I went through college as a creative writing major and was very heavily involved in writing poetry. And after I got out of college, I was involved in the poetry scene in Boston a bit and was really into that. And, you're always told to kind of combine the things you like, mm-hmm. right? And sort of on a lark, sort of for fun, I think it was like 1982 or 1983, I decided that on opening day, I would combine two things I liked, poetry and baseball. And I would go outside the Green Monster at Fenway Park on opening day, starting about 9 o'clock in the morning. The game started, I think, at 1. And I would read baseball poetry. And so I got an old baseball uniform, and a friend loaned me a little pig-nosed battery-operated amplifier. And I went out there with a binder full of poems, and I read baseball poetry in uniform while drinking a massive 2-liter bottle of Bloody Marys. I sent out press releases ahead of time.
Wow.
And oddly enough, people profiled me, people interviewed me, and nobody hit me. I got jeered some, I got cheered some, but the response was actually pretty positive. And I ended up doing that for 9 years. And a couple of times friends of mine joined me. I ended up on TV a lot. I ended up on radio a lot. I also ended up meeting people there. I mean, I met Bill Littlefield of NPR's Only a Game.
Yeah.
Right when he was getting started, because he did a story on me. I met the late George Kimball, sports writer for the Boston Herald that way. I met some friends that way. It was kind of a nutty kid crazy thing to do, but it was the two things, combining two things, and I thought, well, maybe there's something to this. And it wasn't long after that, a couple of years after I started doing that I kind of stumbled onto this intriguing sports story about why the Boston Red Sox manager killed himself in 1907. I thought it was interesting. I worked at the Boston Public Library at the time. I could research the story in the old microfilm newspapers because we had them all, and at that time there were 8 or 10 daily newspapers in Boston, and I kind of sort of figured out what happened. I thought it was a great story. Well, what do I do with this? Well, I'll write a story about it. I'll try to sell it. How do you do that? I looked at a book that said how to be a freelance writer. Okay. This is how you write a pitch letter. Okay. Sent it off to 2 places. The Boston Globe Sunday Magazine sent me a mimeographed rejection letter. I always tell people it was mimeographed because that places it in time, because mimeographs are artifacts now of an earlier age. And Boston Magazine, the editor, asked me to come see him. And I've written about it a number of times, but I went in and I talked to him for an hour, and he decided to take the story on spec. And as I was leaving his office, he said, "You can write, can't you?" Because I had no clips.
Yeah.
And I said I could. And, about a week later, after staying up, I'm still working full-time, staying up nights and going in early and doing more research and then writing it out longhand 4 or 5 times. I went into the library, used the IBM Correctable Selectric typewriter because I'm not a touch typist. I'm still not. I just use a couple of fingers. I typed it up. I turned it in. They bought it, and he said, "What do you want to do next?" And I've never been without an assignment. I realized then that this was it was a lane I enjoyed, kind of sports history, and that the kind of research I was doing, not many people were doing it. And I was able to kind of duplicate that story, that process, over and over and over and over again. And to a degree, I still do. Because a lot of people don't want to put in the hours of research that that historical work needs. I enjoy it, so it doesn't bother me. But sometimes you sit in front of a microfilm machine for 2 weeks.
Yeah, I think
all day long.
Yeah.
I enjoy that.
Yeah, and I think there's also a fear that that you can do a lot of research, maybe weeks and months of research, maybe more accurately is weeks, and come away with nothing. So you feel like you wasted a lot of time too, and maybe people don't. There's such an urgency to try to get your work out there and get your work published that you almost don't. That people don't want to put in that initial pre-reporting, pre-research with that uncertainty.
I mean, I just didn't know any better. I only knew one way to do it.
Yeah.
And there's hardly anything that I ever did much research on that never turned into anything. I think I basically sold everything I ever wrote.
Oh, that's great.
And I didn't realize that was a difficult thing. Had I known what I know now about this whole business, I was like, why would I have even tried?
Yeah.
And I tell that to people all the time now. Nothing about doing this makes any logical sense. It doesn't. It didn't then. It doesn't now. Nevertheless, people continue to do it. Because when people say, should I try this? Should I go freelance? Should I do this? That's what I tell them. It doesn't make any sense. If you stop and think about it, it doesn't make any sense. But people do it all the time.
Yeah, I think what you touched upon earlier, too, is when you were pitching your first couple assignments, is that you had this full-time day job. And I think that's really important to note that that's not uncommon for people to have that.
I get a little frustrated sometimes when I hear from younger writers, who are 24, 25, who are frustrated that they, don't have a full-time job doing this, that they're not, pulling down $100,000 writing for somebody. I didn't write that first story until I was 27 years old. I was out of college 5 years.
Yeah.
And I get, people who are frustrated, who are 25, 26, and have already have an arm's length worth of clips, You know, and I try to tell them, you are so far ahead of me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's unimaginable.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's something to be said for patience. And I never had a full-time job doing this until the last couple of years.
Yeah.
You know, that was never something I really thought of. I mean, I was, and I have been extraordinarily lucky. There's no question about that. But the other thing, you can only control one thing, and that's your effort.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and, you know, I did work really hard. I have worked really hard. You know, and, you know, sometimes people hear that and they go, oh, God, here we go. It's the old, you know, pull yourself up by your bootstraps bullshit. But it's like, there's one thing you can control, and that's your effort. You can't control anything else. Anything else. So, you know, control what you can, and, you know, if the work itself to a point isn't the reward, you shouldn't be doing it anyway.
Right. The horizon.
If you need somebody to hand you a check to make sure you, I mean, you know, when I say I didn't publish anything until 27, that didn't mean that I didn't write between the ages of 21 and 27. I wrote all the time.
Yeah.
I wasn't writing prose necessarily, but I was writing. No one was handing me a check. No one was telling me to do it. I had a group that would get together in my apartment once every couple of weeks on usually like a Wednesday night, and our only rule was you had to bring something to read, and it was better if you wrote it. Mm-hmm. And we would sit around and read stuff out aloud, mostly what we'd written ourselves. If not, we could bring something interesting that you wanted others to know about, and we'd do that, and we'd start drinking beer and start talking, and that gave us an impetus to continue to write. At a time when you're just out of school where, you know, you don't have an assignment anymore. Mm-hmm. You know, nobody's giving you a check to do this, but if this is what you want to do, you find a reason to do it. And that was the reason to do it, because you didn't want to stand up there, you know, with your pants down around your ankles with nothing to read in front of your friends.
Yeah, it's like you said, like, you know, the horizon is, you can never catch the horizon, so you have to be grounded in the work. You know, if you get a piece published in the New Yorker or anything, it's not really going to necessarily change anything, because you're just going to keep riding on. So unless you're grounded in the process of the work and love process, then you're always going to be miserable. It's just because there's
exactly. You know, you're always going to be chasing after something that's unattainable.
Right. Yep.
You know, I mean, not everything I've done has been as successful as I've wanted it to be. Not everything has, you know, sold as much or made as much money or made as much an impact. But, you know, you can't control that. You can only control what you do. And, you know, if you're, you know, and in a lot of ways, things that haven't done very well have been satisfactory to me. I mean, some of the things that I'm most happy with ever having written, you know, are things that have never been published. You know,
yeah.
You know, but this is what I do, and this is how I, how I define myself in this world. It's through words and doing things with words.
Right. And, if someone like shook you awake in the middle of the night and woke you up from sleep and said, "What do?" You probably say, "I'm a writer."
That's it. I write.
Yeah.
You know, and that entails a lot of things. That entails writing books. That entails, you know, writing articles. That entails editing. That entails, you know, poems. This is, you know, I write every day, and not like I'm not like a metronome, and I don't follow a schedule. But you know, this is what I do every single day.
And when you were crafting those poems, and then you stood outside the Green Monster and everything, did you throw down a hat or a bucket, and did people give you dollar bills?
Yeah,
or
we did.
change?
You know, we might make $5.
Mm-hmm.
You know, over the course of 4 hours.
Yep.
You know, it would not that was gone with the first beer. You know.
Of course. Where do you think that industriousness came from? Because you said you sent out press releases and everything, and then that really fueled your freelancing.
Just, you know, being young and sort of cocky.
Mm-hmm.
You know, glutton for attention. You know, I mean, I'm kind of funny. I have no trouble like speaking publicly, talking publicly. Put me in front of a crowd of anybody, I can, you know, that's fine. I'm far less comfortable like one-on-one, like walking into a cocktail party and having to find somebody to talk to.
Yeah.
If I have a role to talk, I can do that. That's fine. Other situations, I'm not very socially adept. So you know, that kind of fed into that. It's to say, hey, I can do this.
Yeah.
You know, I can't talk to a stranger, but I can do this. You know.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny. It's still that way.
So what needs to be in place for you to pursue a story, or what's your green light for you you see something and you're like, okay, this is something I can really lean into and pursue with all your energy?
Well, you know, are you talking about something that's for my own writing?
Yeah, for your own writing.
Well, it's something I don't know anything about.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the safest and simplest answer. Or there's something I thought I knew about, and now I realize that it's not true. I think it's not true. So what really happened?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's those two things. I know nothing about this, so I'm going to find out about it. Or what I know about this is wrong, and I want to find out the truth.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's basically been, I would say, probably a guiding force behind just about everything I've written, whether it's, you know, the baseball titles I've done, you know, Red Sox Century, which exploded a lot of myths about the Red Sox and was basically the first book to get into, to take race seriously with the Red Sox and to explore many of their myths, to, you know, the oral history I did with the workers the construction workers at Ground Zero, which, you know, if you still ask most people today, they think that was primarily done by police and firemen. You know, it wasn't. The construction workers were there every day for 9 months. 95% of the police and firemen worked a two or 3 week rotation and were gone and never came back.
Huh.
You know, the construction workers bore the brunt of that. And then, like the Gertrude Ederle book, you know, I stumbled across, why hadn't I heard about her? Why hadn't I heard that in 1926 this 19-year-old woman became the 5th person to swim the English Channel, and she broke the existing men's record by 2 hours?
Yeah.
Why didn't I know that?
Yeah.
I knew about Jackie Robinson. You know?
Yeah.
I knew about all these other pioneers, but I'd never heard about her. So I want to find out. And you start poking around and, you know, you start talking to people. If there's people to talk to, you start reading everything you can about it. And you start constructing the narrative that previously did not exist.
Specifically with Young Woman in the Sea, how surprised were you that nothing extensive had been, or nothing to the point that was satisfactory to you as a reader, was done on her and allowed you to go?
Because, you know, she's kind of a seminal figure. I mean, you can take women's sports before her and afterwards, and basically before her there isn't any, and after her is a flood. Yet she hadn't been written about, and when I first kind of stumbled over her, she was still alive. She was well up into her 90s, but she was still alive. That may have had a part to do with it, why no one had written about her. I don't know. She'd stayed out. She'd lived a very private life and stayed out of the limelight, and people just weren't looking backwards very closely. You know, so I really don't know. Now, of course, as soon as I decided to do a book, 2 other people did too. Yeah. Which is always, you know, you always run into that too. But, you know, I just went ahead regardless.
Right. And what was the, you know, I love how you started that book too with that sort of gripping scene of just these people who can't swim. A lot of people who drown because swimming just wasn't something people did.
You know, one of the reasons why that story had never been told is because it's kind of, you had to know a lot just to even tell it.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things you had to know was that basically, before the turn of the century, is that people in the West did not swim.
Mm-hmm.
Very few people knew how to swim. A staggeringly few number. I mean, if you look at any picture of people on the beach at the turn of the century, the beaches are black with people, and there'll be like 10 people in the water.
Mm-hmm.
No one knew how to swim. And part of it was cultural, and part of it was moral, particularly with women, and women in particular didn't swim. So I felt the reader needed a lot of education just to realize how amazing this was,
mm-hmm.
and put it in the context of the era of when people were arguing, that women couldn't run more than 200 yards.
Yeah.
That you're a woman, you weren't even supposed to sweat. And here's this, partially deaf 19-year-old, and she swims across the English Channel.
Yeah.
Kind of amazing.
Yeah. So, what was your, what's your approach to the research and the writing? Once you're into the story, like, what does your day kind of look like as you go forward with a project?
Well, I mean, if you have to go somewhere to do research, that's a different thing. Like if I have to go into, Boston to use the library or New York or somewhere else, you go to these places and you go into the library or wherever where the research materials are, and you go in at 9 a.m. and you come out at 5, and you do that because you have to make use of that time. In general, now if I'm working on a book, what I like to do is I like to work first thing in the morning, for one,
mm-hmm.
and I like to put in several hours and then take somewhat of a break, and then every time I go back to the material, I always go like a couple of pages, maybe 500 words back to what I just written, and I revise forward, and that puts me back into the flow, and then I continue to write. Myself, my pace, I think it's important that every writer learns how they work.
Mm-hmm.
It's useful to hear how other people work, but just because one person is so disciplined that they write 1,500 words by 5:49 every morning, and you don't do that, doesn't mean that you're not a writer.
Yeah.
Neither does it mean if you don't stay up all night and write on your bed that you're not a writer, or sit in a coffee shop. You find what works for you.
Mm-hmm.
And I found what worked for me. And for me, it's like, hey, I can get 2,000 good words out a day. I can do more, and I have, but they're not going to be good ones. And in the long run, I'm going to have to go back and spend just as much time to get to the end. If I write 8,000 words in one day, that's going to take me 3 or 4 days to fix.
Yeah.
If I do about 2,000 a day, that works. So you just, you put your head down, you organize your notes in the way that you're comfortable with. I mean, Wright Thompson has these elaborately organized binders. That's great for Wright Thompson.
Mm-hmm.
I got piles of stuff stacked all over the place.
Yeah.
That's really efficient for Wright. My way is really efficient for me. It doesn't mean his is better. It doesn't mean mine's better.
Mm-hmm.
Find what works for you. And then don't get hung up on how other people do things. Certainly if you find somebody does something that's useful for you, adopt that method. Steal that idea, sure.
Yeah.
But find what works for you, and then just go forward with it.
Yeah, I find that...
And for me, it's like, you organize things sort of in order by time, and you try to tell that story.
Absolutely.
Try to find the story in the mass of stories you have. Every story is made up of a lot of little stories.
Yeah, and then it's just a matter of linking them, and then voila, you have narrative.
Well, linking them or sometimes seeing the larger story in those little stories.
Yeah.
The larger story often isn't in the little stories.
Mm-hmm.
But cumulatively, it might be in the little stories.
Mm-hmm. How do you decide which of those little stories might... isolated doesn't feel like it belongs, but in the grand picture, it makes sense?
For me, there's just an organic feel to it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you do a book proposal, you have to write an outline, and I do one. and generally I never look at it again. I have a rough idea of what I want to do, and even if I do have an outline, if it's more than 2 pages, I've really been trying to impress somebody because, it doesn't mean anything to me. But once the material starts coming together, I can't, I was talking to somebody about this earlier this morning, I can't think stories out in advance until I start putting it together on the page. That's the time when, for me, and other people might be different, connections start being made. Mm-hmm. Start seeing what resonates. You start seeing what speaks to itself in the story. You start seeing a narrative come out. It might not be the exact one you thought that was there, and that's fine. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot to be said for making sure that you allow creative, organic discovery and evolution to take place, rather than trying to be this controlling dictator who's going to force a story to a place where it doesn't want to go. I talk to writers about that a lot. Oh, you always write what is. You don't write what you want. Okay? A lot of people get in trouble trying to write what they want rather than writing what is. I never have an issue with a writer who the story changes. Mm-hmm. And they say, I thought it was going to be this, but when I got there, it's this. Is that okay? I'm like, that's absolutely okay. The last thing I want is a story that you're making into something that it's not. So, and that's kind of a feel thing from just practice. Is you've had that happen with stories, and you just start to detect the narrative, the important narrative. It's like if you're a pitcher, you've pitched a long time, when you can get away with that fastball right down the middle, because that's the last thing they're looking for, mm-hmm. Right? It makes no sense to throw that pitch unless you've been pitching a long time, and then it's a perfect pitch. Stories are the same way. You find the story, you intuit it before it's obvious.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to explain, but at least that's how it works for me.
Right, and so you do realize that you're like a living saint among writers because of your editing prowess, don't you? Like everyone.
That's a really nice thing to say. I'm doing the best I can. I haven't been doing this very long, but I've done it a lot in a short period of time. I've really enjoyed it. It's been really gratifying. It was an utter surprise to me that, like when I started doing this with SB Nation 3.5 years ago, it was a real surprise to me how, for really no known reason except my name had been on that sports writing book for 20-some years.
Yeah.
But it was an utter shock to me that people looked at me to discover people looked at me the way they did, because I'm just this guy up in Vermont, Yeah. I was out of the nobody was paying much attention to me. Mm-hmm. And my career was not going very far. The book business was really bad, and, I was just trying to figure out what to do next, and then this kind of popped up, and, I'll never forget, I went to a writing conference a little over a year after I did this, and a young writer who I really respected, who I was kind of like, wow, I can't believe I'm meeting him. And he just stops and he says, this is so surreal, you can't imagine that I'm sitting here talking to you. And I'm going, what? It's really kind of gratifying. I had no idea that the book meant as much as it did to people. Mm-hmm. I've just been doing my thing. And, having some interactions with people, but not that. I moved out of Boston in the Boston area in 2001, 2002. And so, not that I'm a total hermit up here, but, I'm just kind of doing my thing. And then, it was really gratifying and really surprising. And over the past 3.5 years, I've had the opportunity to work with over 100 writers directly on stories and things. And I've enjoyed that with just about every single one. Some of them become friends. I could not be more surprised.
Yeah, I wonder what.
I could not be more surprised.
Yeah, at this point, are you? What do you identify most with? Being an editor or a writer?
I think I kind of answered it before. I think it's all kind of the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Because I went into this editing thing, my only thoughts going into it were, I'm going to try to do this the way I think it should be done.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't think I've ever particularly, except the very start, ever had an editor per se who was worth anything.
Yeah.
I've always graded against some parts of this process that I thought were bad and poorly done, like this editing by committee that takes place at so many places, or this kind of dictatorial editing. And I worked with some editors in the book industry who are quote unquote supposedly some of the best in the business. I was just appalled by the way they work.
Yeah.
And the way they treat people, and their and how inept they were with the language, with actual stories. And so I was like, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it the way I want it. And if it doesn't work, that's fine. So that's exactly what I did, because if it wasn't, and then I worked really hard, but if I would have been told you have to do this way, I don't think I would have done it, and I certainly wouldn't have done it very well. And I can only thank Jim Bankoff at Vox Media for. I still know what was going through his head when he contacted me and asked me if I wanted to do this. I have no idea why I was asked, but I was, and I've enjoyed it. They seem to think I'm doing okay. Other people seem to like the work we come out with. Like I said, because I try to do it. I try to look at it from a writer's perspective. Mm-hmm. I don't want you to write like I write. I don't want our stories to all feel the same. I don't want to be telling you what to do. I want to try to make this a collaboration. Mm-hmm. Readers don't care how we get there.
Right.
Really don't. They could care less. They want a good story.
So how many pitches do you field per week?
It can really vary. Like I was having a month ago, for whatever reason, all of a sudden, maybe it was because the holidays are coming, I wasn't getting any, and I was like, oh my God. So I kind of put this call out, and for whatever reason, and I've been a little sick recently, this deluge has come in, and it's like I got 5 last night.
Oh man.
So and people say, well, what percentage do you use? That can really vary too. Sometimes it's like, hey, if you're the only person that pitched me this week, and you've got a good pitch, you've got a really good chance.
Yeah.
If you've got a really good pitch and you're one of 10 people that pitched me this week, that's going to be tougher. Mm-hmm. And, sometimes there's some serendipity in that.
Yeah.
And sometimes people send me full stories.
Mm-hmm.
I get that, too. And then I get a lot of queries that make me wonder what they're thinking. Hi, I'd like to write. This is what I'd like to... These are the things I write about. Do you have anything for me? I mean, I get those every week.
Wow.
And it's just like, on my website, I often refer people to my website. I've got a section there called About SB Nation Longform that tells you how to pitch a story. I actually link to something from, I think it's Stanford, or University of California, one of the two, that's a real good guide to how to write a pitch. Mm-hmm. Because 90% of the writers who I interact with probably don't know how to write a pitch. It's generally, so I've been told, not taught in grad school. So people will go through a magazine writing course in grad school or a whole program, and no one will have ever told them how to write a pitch. And wow, that's really important. I mean...
Yeah, that seems to be a real market inefficiency. Like if you can really hone your pitching, you're gonna just the cream will rise to the top.
Reporting. Don't tell me you want to write a story about Peyton Manning.
Yeah.
And then have me ask, well, do you have a contact over there? Well, no, but I think I can. It's like I can't go on think I can,
Yeah.
Do just a little. Make sure you can get to people you want to get to.
Yeah.
Make sure you can get to the story. don't tell me you want to write a story in France if you live in California.
Yep.
And you've never written anything before. I'm not going to send you to France.
Yeah.
Look in your backyard.
Yeah.
I advise people all the time, look in your backyard for stories. I mean, I live here in remote northern Vermont. Right now, today, I know of 2 stories within 10 miles of me that if I needed to write a story, that I could write those stories today.
Mm-hmm. Tracy Kidder made a career out of backyard narratives.
Yeah, you can do that. Or, do what I did. Look at history.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a market for history of all kinds in, like, regional and city magazines, that kind of stuff. Those stories are evergreen. There's always anniversaries coming up, things like that. There's lots of ways to get in here. The way not to get in is to write a story, is to write a pitch that isn't a pitch about a story you have no access to. I mean, even though I did that.
Yeah. Yeah, I've done that too.
Got in without any clips.
Yeah.
But I mean, I've ended up having great relationships with writers who wrote terrible pitches, but I liked their writing.
Mm-hmm.
There's one of our writers who's identified with SB Nation pretty closely, who wrote me probably the worst pitch ever. And, the pitch was not horrible, but the end was like, well, you're probably not going to be interested in this. I'm sorry, I probably shouldn't even bothered, thanks for taking. And I was like, I got mad. I called him, I was like, what are you doing?
Yeah. It's like someone trying to sell you a car and be like, you know what, actually, yeah, you don't want this car.
Exactly, and we did that story, and it did really well.
Yep.
And this person has done really well since then. But why did I go after him? Well, one was he made me mad, but also in his pitch, just in the way it was written, his voice had a sound.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just words.
Yep.
He had a sound.
And that's important to you.
It's hugely important.
Yep.
Sound is, there's a great biography of Jack Kerouac called, I think, The Sound Is All.
Mm-hmm.
Sound is all. And I fully agree with that.
So what
There's
brings...
a lot of people who are great reporters who can't write with any sound.
No.
Some writers who can write with sound who aren't very good reporters who can get away, and I can get away with it because of that. But, ideally, you want to have both, and every writer is different. You might start out kind of with a sound and not have the skills to put a story together, or you might have all the reporting skills you need, but as a writer, you don't have your sound yet.
Mm-hmm.
I see, my goal is to get writers to a place where, where they're operating in both arenas.
Which of those two do you think is sort of the uncoachable fastball? Do you think you can learn reporting?
Because you can only coach that yourself.
Yeah.
And you only get that by reading and listening.
Mm-hmm.
I can't read and listen for you.
Yep.
I can help you with reporting. I can help you with structure. I can't put the paint on the canvas.
Mm-hmm.
You have to do that. I can't play your instrument for you. You have to do that, and you only get good at that by, that's why the first, only, and best advice to any writer is read.
Yeah.
Read, because it's like playing an instrument. Every time you read is going through scales.
Mm-hmm.
You got to read, you got to read, you got to read, you got to read. You have to know how words sound. You have to intuit that. You don't want to be sitting at your laptop trying to decide what the grammar rule is.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? I don't know, to tell you the truth. I probably couldn't pass an 8th grade grammar test. But I know what words sound like.
Mm-hmm.
And I know when they sound right together.
Yeah. You know when the guitar is in tune.
It just comes from playing.
Yeah.
This comes from reading. and you do it then without thinking. I play the bowran, which is a skin drum. I can't keep time if I'm thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
But if I've practiced enough, then I'm right there, and I start doing things that I'm not even thinking about because my something internally is telling me what fits and what doesn't.
So what brings you back, or what inspires you as an editor and a writer?
Boy, I keep it simple. The goal of anything you write, the goal of anything you read is you want to read it again.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want it to be just something pleasant that goes by.
Yep.
You want it to be something that makes you lose yourself in it and read it again. That's the stuff. People say, how can you keep doing the sports writing book? My God, you have to look at all this stuff. How can you keep on doing it? Because every month or so, every couple of weeks, a story makes me go, whoa.
Mm-hmm.
And I forget how much time I've just spent reading it.
Yeah.
And it might have been 10 minutes, it might have been 20 minutes. Because the best work takes you completely, you lose yourself in time.
Mm-hmm.
With it. And it's timeless. I'll never forget, there's a poem by Theodore Rutke, who's one of my favorite poets. And for whatever reason, I had heard that poem read first before I ever saw it on the page. And I'll never forget when I saw it on the page, just being stunned that it was like 8 lines long. Read aloud, it was timeless. I had no idea how long this poem was because it took me someplace.
Mm-hmm.
And it spit me out a different person.
Yeah.
And then I see it, and it's just these, 8 or 9 simple lines.
Wow.
I'm like, you kidding me? But that's the power, that's what I...
What's like that opening line to that Hughes poem, Kissing the River?
Langston Hughes poem is that it takes you out of this experience and brings you to this other experience, this other reality. Words do change things. Not much else really does.
Right. And I wonder where, and you're kind of alluding to it right now, but I wonder where your optimism lies with narrative and with this really unpredictable media landscape. Like, where do you...
You just can't... no matter what happens, people are going to write. This is an impulse that is built in us from the start. We tell stories. That's how we connect with each other. We tell stories.
Yep.
That's as old as the human experience. So just because those stories aren't being monetized right now in ways that are particularly easy for people to participate in doesn't affect the fact that we tell stories. And at one point or another, there will be forums for those stories. Now, maybe it's going to be, Armageddon, and we're all going to be sitting around the fire in the tin can in the backyard of some apocalyptic nightmare. We're going to be telling stories.
Mm-hmm.
Or it might be in some brand new media that's all flashy and shiny that makes us wealthy. We're going to be telling stories. You cannot go through this world. You can't.
Yeah,
without telling stories, without listening to stories, without participating in stories, without living a story. Somebody earlier this week, told me, like, oh, you need to write a memoir. I was like, no. I don't need that kind of introspection, personally.
You had enough of that when you were growing up.
If you write a memoir, then the story's over.
Yeah.
You can't change it then. I can tell you the same story 10 times. I can make it better every time. That's what editing is. Editing is you're just telling the same story over and over, making it better. When you finally publish it, it's kind of disappointing.
Yeah.
Because, damn, now it's this.
Yeah, exactly.
And, you want it to be the greatest thing this person's ever written. You want it to be the best thing you've ever worked on. You want it to be the best thing about the subject. And then it's, at a certain point you realize, 99.9% of the time, it's not going to be that. Well, okay, you still have to make it as best as you can. But, you have to remain aspirational. I ask all my writers, I want this to be the best story you've ever done. Let's start with that.
Yeah, and why not start there? Why not be ambitious?
Let's start with that. I mean, what do you want to do? Well, I want this to be, the 60% best story I've ever done.
No.
Screw that, I mean, and I understand, we're not going to make it all the time. But, God damn it, every once in a while we do.
Yeah, it's like
That's
if you...
really exciting. And then it's like, once you've done something great once, you want to do better.
Yeah.
And you can see, even in this thing that everybody's telling you is great, that, I could have done this, I could have done this, I could have done this. And all of a sudden, your end goal is at a different place than it was. You might have just been trying to get another contract.
Mm-hmm.
Now you're trying to do something else. And a contract's nice. I'm not diminishing how difficult it is to make a living in this business. I did it for 22 years without a job. And I know how hard it is. And, it's not like believe me, the best American sports writing does not pay a living wage. Doesn't pay a minimum wage. That is not something you live off of, believe me.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to do all sorts of other things and cobble it together. I know it's hard. Okay, but as I said before, you can control how hard you work, and you can try to tell the best story you can.
Absolutely.
That's all you can do, and you can look at the work at the end and then say, okay, now let's see, if the world will meet me with this. Mm-hmm. I mean, I had an early writing teacher, Robert Kelly at Bard College, a poetry teacher there. He told us all not to worry about publishing anything. He says, as long as you share it with people, he says, if it's good enough, it will end up published.
Mm-hmm.
Just, as long as you're not writing it and sticking it in a drawer.
Yeah.
But share it with your friends. That's how I did.
Yeah, Seth, it's funny you bring that up.
It's like, and he also told us, he says, you're probably not going to write anything worthwhile until you're 30. He says, by the time you're 30, he says, if you're still writing, he says, you're a writer.
Yeah.
And, he says your next 10 years, from 20 to 30, is going to determine whether you're a writer or not. Because you're going to have to learn to do this on your own, outside of a structure of school where you're getting, constant feedback and support. Your friends are patting you on the back and all this stuff. You move into the work part of it, where you're there by yourself with your ass in a chair, doing it. And you do it one day, and then you do it the next day, and then you do it the next day. And it might be a year or 2 years or 5 years or 10 till anybody tells you you're doing something good. Well, where was it supposed to be easy?
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to overstate it. I'm not trying to, come off like, I'm like, this, Nobel Prize winner or anything. I'm a ham and egger guy, man. I'm a, I'm a AAA outfielder.
There's the pull quote.
But you play.
Yeah, absolutely.
You play. You go out there. You do it.
Yeah, exactly. There's no illusion to this, and I think it's beneficial for people to hear that it is work. You don't just...
I did a lot of construction work when I was young.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? That's how I got through college. So I poured a lot of concrete. And I tell people I learned as much about writing from that as from anything else. Writing a book is hard. Writing a book is complicated. So is building an 800,000 square foot warehouse.
Yep.
You got to put a lot of work into that. It takes a long time, but you do things incrementally. And goddamn, after a year, there's this building.
Mm-hmm.
Goddamn, after a year, there's this book.
Yeah.
And
you got to go in and punch the clock.
You you get up with the sun, and you go out there every day. I mean, it's ridiculously simple in it's ridiculously simple in some ways. And I try to make the point that there is nothing really special about this. People go to work every day doing all sorts of things. This is not so precious.
Right.
It's, it's nice to think that, and I think we all have at some point, and we like to think with the tortured artist and all this stuff. And, one of the most poignant things I've ever read was a quote from Rimbaud, who gave up writing at like age 20. And he said something like, nobody's serious at 17. Because he was, and nobody else was. And it's easy to feel that way, and it's easy to feel shut off. And it's easy for people to say, well, Glenn, that's easy for you to say. You've done this, that, and the other thing. But, it's not, believe me. There's a lot of staring at the abyss. You don't know what's next.
Right.
And, Stephen King or somebody, you got enough money, you don't have to worry about it. But for the rest of us, there's always the anxiety of what comes next. And it's really no different. Scarier a little now because I actually do know how hard it is.
Mm-hmm.
When I was younger, I was kind of oblivious. I didn't know it was as hard as it was.
Yeah, that early success that you had, it kind of, in a good way, kind of like polluted you. It was the validation you needed, and had you known otherwise, maybe you would have taken a different track.
Like 5 years later, I just, I quit my job and said, well, I'll cash in my retirement and try to do this writing thing. If it doesn't work, I'll just get another job. And I didn't really think twice about it.
Mm-hmm.
And, when I think about that now, it's like, because I'm making really good money at that point. What the hell were you thinking? But, you don't go through this world to sit in your chair in the corner, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's, I want to be respectful of your time. I think that's a perfect way to end our conversation for today. Certainly, I'd love to continue at another time when your book comes out next year, and we can talk about that too.
Yeah, no trouble. I consider, conversations like this is part of what I do too.
Yeah.
Much of editing, I probably spend almost as much time talking writing as I do writing or editing, with both people who are writing for me and other writer friends, and this is how we connect ourselves. This is how we support ourselves, how we support each other. We tell stories, even when we're talking about stories.
Yeah, and selfishly, this podcast, I as humble as it is, I desperately need this to talk to people like Greg Hanlon, Joe DiPaolo,
mm-hmm.
Carrie Hagan, you, all these people. I need to hear these voices.
It's hey, it's not a very big tribe.
Yeah.
But at its core and at its heart, it's a very, very close tribe, because, this is something which I think people outside writing don't understand. You write alone, and what we do is take that time spent alone and turn it into a story so we can be with other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's beautiful. Well, like I said, Glenn, I want to be respectful of your time, and thank you so much for carving out an hour this morning.
This is what I do, man.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad it is what you do, and I'm glad you continue to do it, and you spend time with folks like me and others, and talking shop. So thanks again, and let's do it again sometime.
I enjoy it as much as you do. So.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Glenn.
Okay.
All right. Take care.
Thanks, Brendan. Bye-bye.
Bye. All right, that's a wrap for episode 14 of #CNF. If you get a chance, give me a follow on Twitter, @BrendanO'Mara. And if you want, head over to my website, BrendanO'Mara.com, and subscribe to the email newsletter. It comes out every Tuesday, if and only if I publish a blog post or any links that pop up through my website. If I don't publish anything for that week, you don't get anything No spam ever. So thanks again for listening, and keep in touch.